All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone is staying dry. I'm so glad we were safe and indoors and stayed home on Tuesday and Wednesday for all the flooding to come in last night. So, for those of you that are in the Somerville, Cane Bay, Moncks Corner area, please let us know if you need anything. I know we have some flooding up there and still trying to get people out of the neighborhood possibly. So, just let us know if you need anything with that. Okay, so what we're going to do with Friday Foresights moving forward is we're basically going to continue to run them Fridays at 11. They're going to remain Zoom just from an accessibility standpoint. Obviously, if we need to do something in person, we will. Um, but basically, we're breaking this down into different parts of this situation. Wednesdays are designated specifically for the mechanics of the change and then talking about the change. So the continued 10 a.m. contracts classes will continue as normal. So that'll go back to describing the contracts. It won't be specific to the changes now. Obviously, the changes will be covered in there. And then Wednesdays at 1 is when we're having the conversation dialogue or session like we had this Wednesday. If you were not able to attend, the video has been sent out or it was posted, so we'll send it out to everyone. But those are really the implementation side of things. What we're going to continue to do on Fridays is basically keep this as a more timely topic. And just every Friday at 11, we're going to jump on here and we're going to talk about what we're seeing as the most prevalent one. I will do everything I can to communicate out to you what the topic will be, just to prevent it from being a general mastermind. Um, but what we're learning very quickly this week is that there are just a lot of nuances that either were not thought out properly by the powers that be, which we can argue that's pretty much the overlying possibility on a lot of the problems. And then just a general understanding or sometimes misunderstanding of what all of this means. So the one that's really coming that really came to surface this week was the difference between compensation and concessions. And I think when we originally think about it, we think to ourselves, well, that seems kind of simple. But I think what we're really getting confused is how that falls into the process of the transaction. And what I will say is the purpose of this conversation today is not only to help you understand it, but also to help you be able to work with other agents to understand it. And I don't want this to come across as any other way than collaboration, but the bottom line is there are a lot of people out there, very experienced people out there that do not understand this. And this is not a judgment statement. It's just everyone is trying to keep up with what everything means. And I think a lot of people just didn't realize how big of a change this was going to be. And then secondly, I just think there is also a lack of support of people understanding this out there. There will also come about some conflict in understanding. That's just going to happen. I don't agree with SCR on some things, and I'm going to ask that we go our route versus SCR routes on some best practices. There's not a lot of them. And I do understand that there will be some brokerages, we've already seen it, where just because of maybe a misunderstanding of how this works, the communication may come across a different way. So I want to ask that all of you have grace in this, just like we would hope for them to have grace for us. And I'm not coming out and saying we're doing it all perfectly, but I do believe that from y'all's experience, the way you guys are being trained, the way that the leadership team is being trained, I do believe that we have a major advantage in this. But with that advantage comes some responsibility to have grace for those people that aren't doing it. Because as an industry, we need to do this together. Okay. So that's just kind of the premise of the discussion today. I don't anticipate this will go long. However, depending on how questions go, we'll see what it looks like. So before we get started, I want to hear three gratitudes. I want to hear three things you're grateful for because this has been a busy week. Nothing like having one of the largest fundamental changes in our industry happen on a Monday and then everyone have to go home for a couple days because of a storm and just stare at the rain. So give me three things that you're grateful for. I want to hear them.
Sunshine.
Yay, sunshine. I took a picture of my dog at my home office window a minute ago, and her look out the window of the sun, she was just like, "Thank God."
It's been too
Two
long.
more. Give me two more.
I'm happy that I was able to help you out and send you those gift cards that you needed earlier in the week.
Yeah, I tell you what. Thank
Yeah.
you.
I'm glad you got those.
I know, man's got to eat. Appreciate it. All right, one more.
Hey, Joseph, it's Constance.
Hey, Constance.
Hey, I'm grateful that no one was hurt and during all the
Yep.
storm and all the water that we had, that really no one, we got lucky.
We did. We did, and thank you for saying that. One of the things that I expressed for gratitude in our leadership call this morning was I'm really grateful for our company and for the region. I mean, the region had a daily, twice a day actually, on a couple of days call just to see how everybody was on the storm, and luckily we didn't need to mobilize anything as far as KW Cares is concerned. But yeah, very grateful that we didn't need it and that it was there. So, okay, so let's jump into this. I'm going to run through just a visual of what I'm talking about with compensation versus concessions. And when I say compensation, sometimes we will intertwine the word compensation and commission, right? So if any time those two words are used, those will be that's what it's the same thing. Okay, so compensations and concessions will be compensation and commission will be the same word, interchangeable, but we're deciphering between the compensation and concession side. Okay. All right, Jay, give me a thumbs up if you're seeing the slide, compensation versus concession. Awesome. All right, so what I want to do is I want to walk through just the trail of the money as it relates to our compensation. All right, so when we're talking about compensation or commission, the big delineation here is that is a payment to a brokerage. Okay, that is the payment that is going to the brokerage. A concession is between the seller and the buyer. And those are just the two things. That's from the beginning, they're completely separate. What the buyer does with the concession is not change the fact that it's a concession, right? So as it relates to compensation, here's how the flow of money can go. First thing is you have compensation that comes from the seller to the broker. Everyone understands this. Scott goes and takes a listing. He signs a listing agreement with the seller. The seller agrees to compensate him through the listing agreement. And in that listing agreement, they will have worked out whether or not some of Scott's compensation will then be paid to the buyer's agent, right? Or it may not. Okay. So if he does agree to do it that way, there will be compensation paid from Scott as the listing broker, as a representative of the listing broker, to whoever the buyer's broker is, the buyer's agent is. The document used for that is a compensation agreement, and that is between the listing broker and the buyer's broker. Okay, so far this is kind of how it's been done. You didn't need a compensation agreement before. You had the MLS that did it. You don't have the MLS anymore. Now, what we are going to start seeing, and we have already seen it, is that there will be listing brokers who may not pay buyer's brokers, or they may not pay the amount to the buyer broker that was agreed upon in the buyer's brokerage agreement. Okay, so the next option for compensation on that would be for compensation to come from the seller to the buyer's broker. That would happen in a compensation agreement between the seller and the buyer's broker. Now, this is one of the areas where some of you will probably ask this. There's a difference here in the opinion from SCR and what we are saying is practice. SCR has said that there should not be a compensation agreement between the seller and the listing broker. That is not correct. If the seller is willing to pay the listing broker, or excuse me, the buyer's broker, their compensation, that would be handled in a compensation agreement. That would not be part of the purchase and sale contract. That is a concession. Okay. This is where the first breakdown is happening. Okay. So this is where I want to pause for a second and just kind of review really quickly. Listing agent's going to pay buyer's agent if they choose not to, or if the seller doesn't want them to, or they're not paying as much as you've agreed to in your buyer agency agreement. The next step could be for the seller to pay the buyer's agent's commission. And that would be done in a compensation agreement. Okay, everyone clear on that? Everybody with me so far? Questions so far? All right, I got a question really quickly. I just got a compensation agreement, company and offer, and then in KW as well as the seller's name. Can this be one comp agreement or does it need to be on either or? Great question. So Jennifer's question was, she just received a compensation agreement and it names the seller and KW is paying compensation on there. This actually is a good technique because right now that buyer's agent does not know, I'm going to go back to the visual, that buyer's agent does not know whether or not your listing agreement is offering out compensation from you as the listing broker, or if they're going to be getting it from the seller. So what they did is they combined this compensation agreement here, as well as this compensation agreement here, and then are letting you decide based on what your agreement is with the seller, who that's going to be between. So in that case, Jennifer, if your listing agreement says that they have agreed to pay you X% and you can pay whatever percentage you guys agree to the buyer's agent, then you would sign a compensation agreement from the listing, not from the seller. However, if your agreement with the listing agent had 0 going to the buyer's agent, then in this case, it would be between the seller and the buyer's agent. That's actually a fantastic example. Does that make sense to everyone? I'm really glad she asked that question because that actually gives a really good visual on that.
So are you saying that one compensation agreement includes both options, and then if one option is only the option available, we have to create a separate one to only apply to that option? Or is it all signed in the same form, just removing the second payee, meaning the seller or the firm, depending on who's doing it?
I'm not sure I totally followed the question, but let me give clarity on it that will probably answer it. So in this case, let's just say that Jennifer had the agreement that said everyone agreed on her side with her and her seller that Jennifer was to offer X% to a buyer's agent. And let's say that X% is what that buyer's agent also has an agreement to with their buyer. Then there would be one compensation agreement signed between Jennifer and the buyer's agent because that's where her commission's coming from. And that's clean. You're done. Compensation's over in that discussion at this point. Now, let's say in this situation, they sent over a compensation agreement for X%, but Jennifer is only giving out less than X%. Then Jennifer would sign the compensation agreement between her and the buyer's broker saying, here's how much I'm offering at this point. And you would sign that compensation agreement. And then the buyer and the buyer's agent would then decide whether or not they're going to ask for that additional amount, either directly from the seller through a compensation agreement, which would, yes, be 2, or they would go on to concessions, which will be the next part.
Thank you. That was very clear. That's exactly what I wanted to know.
Awesome. Okay, awesome. Jay.
So in that example, you specified, there was basically a secondary compensation that's being paid because the seller, or I'm sorry, yes, the seller was offering not enough to compensate what the buyer's agent had said in their compensation agreement. So
Correct.
having to add in that extra part that's not included in the initial buyer agency compensation agreement is just
okay.
Just so that we're clear on like where it's coming from.
Yep. Okay. So let's do this. Good question. Let's pause and jump back on here. Okay. So let's use a straightforward example, and then we'll go into the nuanced side of this. So in this case, we've kind of gotten to compensation from seller to buyer's broker. Now, in the event that this compensation agreement between the seller and the buyer's broker, or this compensation agreement between the listing broker, if either one of them, let me just start with the listing broker one. If that does not equal what's in the buyer's agency agreement, the next 2 options for the buyer are either a compensation agreement from the seller, but quite frankly, the discussion would go immediately to the buyer where that compensation would come from their buyer via their buyer agency agreement. Okay. And this is where it gets confusing. And I promise you, when you have read through this the gazillion times that I have, it will make more sense. I don't yes, everyone right now is like, holy crap, this is way more complicated than it should be. It's really not. It's just how we haven't done it before. And the reason it's complicated now, I'll say this, the reason it seems complicated to us now is because we've relied so heavily on the MLS to already dictate this for us, which is why the lawsuit happened. And so that's, this is a good thing because it's causing more conversation. But in the meantime, let's be honest, it's just kind of like when you go on a first date and you don't know what to say and you've never been on a date before and you kind of sound like an idiot. Like that's kind of where we are now. So we're just recording the compensation and concession discussion. I
So
pulled that one
Joseph,
off in there. Just go.
I love that reference.
Joseph,
Yes, Bill.
could you review for me why a buyer agent would want to do that? First of all, I'm a little slow today.
Okay. When you say do that, do what?
I have the second compensation agreement. Well,
You're short on your buyer agency agreement that you initially asked them to pay you, your buyer. So if you agreed with your buyer to pay you a certain amount and the agent that is the listing agent is only offering a smaller amount of that compensation, then you can request in another compensation agreement for the difference from the seller to try to get them.
That in a nutshell, Bill, is when. Here's the deal. The chances of this being, let me go back to the shared screen. Here's the thing. When you're looking at these two center ones here, the chances of you having a compensation agreement for X amount from the listing agent and then another one from the seller to cover the difference is probably pretty minimal. Typically in that situation, what you're going to have happen is the seller's going to say, listen, I've already stated how much I want to pay to commissions in this. If you want your buyer to cover the rest, then you can negotiate that in concessions. Where this would happen is really what this timeline shows more of is if the listing agent is just not offering compensation, then your next step could be to go to the seller directly. And I think we're going to see that a lot in these companies that have already taken the stand that they're not offering co-op. EXP's got their listing agreement that has said they're not offering co-op. Pause. Quick side note. EXP is not a villain for this. I want to go ahead and be very clear on this. EXP did not do anything wrong with this. I'm not saying I agree with when they did it and how, but let's be very careful on how we're communicating that on social media. What EXP decided to do is not a terrible thing. And I do believe that a lot of agents are going to go ahead and start doing it anyway from a strategic standpoint. And I do believe a lot of companies will maybe follow suit just from a liability standpoint. Okay, I digress. Come back. So what I think is going to happen often in that situation, whether it's EXP, Carolina One, or whoever it may be, or just an agent, we've had some of our agents that have had sellers that have said, no, I do not want you to offer compensation. I'm going to pay you this fee. And then if the buyer wants to pay their compensation to their agent out of concessions, we'll negotiate that later. So all that to say, coming back to Bill's specific question, it will not happen often where you have a compensation agreement with a seller as well as with a listing agent. What will happen is if you have a listing agent that's not offering compensation, and then one of your options could be to go directly to the seller first via the listing agent.
Right. The other question I had is that over my career I've done probably hundreds of one-time showing agreements with for sale by owner sellers. And we always get them to sign that before we even tell them we have a buyer, because they never want to pay you, to begin with. So if you don't get that signed in advance, you're not covered. So why wouldn't we do this in advance of ever writing an offer or showing the property? Get that commission agreement, compensation agreement filled out.
Yeah. So two questions on this, and I'll be brief on these because I'm going to stick to the compensation concession discussion. However, first of all, getting it in advance on all of your showings is logistically probably not going to be realistic. Just from a communication standpoint, everything.
Agreed.
However, from an offer standpoint, I absolutely, best case scenario, would have a compensation agreement, understanding what has already been agreed to as far as commission's concerned before writing an offer, because obviously your buyer is going to want to know if they're having to cover a difference using cover the difference at closing.
Right. So my take on it is, yeah, it's not going to happen on every time, but if you run across a listing that's offering no compensation, then I think it would be prudent to have it signed in advance.
I would agree it would be signed in advance of the offer. I don't think that changes whether or not it's prior to showing.
Yeah. Can you do that if you choose to? Is that all?
You can 100%.
Yeah.
No, it's not out of bounds. You just then need to make sure your buyer is completely aware of that ahead of time.
Yeah.
You can't decide to not show the property if you don't know the commission. Only the buyer can make that decision, and I don't think that would be in the highest and best interest of the buyer, because
Right.
they already know what they could be obligated to, and you don't know how much you'll be able to negotiate. A, with the compensation agreement, or B, in concessions, which we'll get to here in a second.
I see it. I see it just puts you at a really huge disadvantage.
Yeah, I think there's a different perspective on that for sure. I think there's no difference now than if, again, and this isn't on Bill, this is very few of you were looking at how much was being offered as a co-op before you were showing property before. And that's really the only difference that this is.
Well,
And if you were probably.
I'm okay with getting some. I'm just not okay with getting none.
Right. Yeah, I get it. And you don't know for sure until negotiations start, because your buyer has agreed to pay you
Right.
in your buyer agency agreement. So there's not a situation where you would get none, because your buyer has already at this point agreed to pay you.
That makes sense.
All right. Jennifer, I see your hand up. I don't know if that's still up from before. In 3, 2, 1. Okay. Jay, did you have one?
Nope, all good.
Okay, perfect. All right, so here's where we are on the compensation. Quick review. Seller to listing agent to buyer's agent, seller to buyer's agent, buyer to buyer's agent. Right, these are the ones that we have in here. The red line showing you what it is, the external or the agreements that you would use. The next part is then concession. In the buyer's agency agreement, if they've agreed to pay you X%, and then you're not getting X%, then at that point in negotiations, they would negotiate a concession from the seller to the buyer. This is at transaction, and it can be applied to the buyer, from the buyer to the buyer's broker, as compensation. But the concession part itself, in this simple slide here, this concession part itself is not commission. And I think that's what's happening a lot right now. And this is where we're going to have to get good at communicating and understanding. And it may involve bringing me and Lisa in on some of these. But for instance, we had an incident yesterday where one of our buyer's agents, reached out to a listing agent, a savvy listing agent. I've known this person for years, and asked if there is compensation. And the response was, our broker has advised us not to disclose, as this is now part of negotiating in the contract. So my immediate reaction, I pushed aside. And now that we all understand this more, basically what that is you more than likely have a listing agent who is still trying to figure this out, because there is either compensation being offered or there is not. Now, if they did come back and say, we are offering compensation, we're willing to negotiate that during the process, at least at that point that's going to go on the compensation agreement. However, if the seller is not offering compensation and simply saying the buyer can pay it however they want, submit an offer for concessions, then that would be the next route. So in that specific situation, all we need is clarity from that listing agent to say, look, because it's a yes or no answer on both, right? They're either offering cooperative compensation or they're not, or it's negotiable. I mean, you could say that. But to say that, to not give an answer at all until you submit an offer, as part of the negotiation of the purchase, that's just a clarity issue. Now, in my mind, or in that person's mind, because I know them, what they're meaning to say is your commission will be negotiable, probably from my listing side. And then if you want to make up the difference in concessions with your buyer, you can. Make sense? Clear as mud? Questions?
So it's just a terminology thing, because the reality is closing costs it depends on what the buyer allowed you to use it for, right? So
it depends on what the buyers choose to use it for, correct? Yep. Cynthia.
So what does it look like? Say we get down the line to where there's an amount left that the buyer had agreed to in the buyer agency agreement that is not being offered from the cooperative compensation. And say you do that
Mhm.
extra compensation agreement on top of that between you and the buyer. What does it look like for them to bring that money? Like, do they write a check to you at closing? Like, I guess I've been working so
Yeah.
much, I'm trying to understand the front end of the
No,
process.
you're good. Oh, you're good. I think you just summarized everyone's life right now. It's like I've been working so much to actually grow the business. It's like I'm not trying to follow it. So one point of clarification, there's not a separate, so in that scenario, well, if you have a buyer agency agreement for X% and you're not getting that amount from the compensation agreement, you do not change your documentation with your buyer. You don't have an additional compensation agreement. That's already covered in the one that you have filled out. Okay, so that's point of clarification number one. Point of clarification number two is it is handled on the HUD. It will then become an expense. So your commission will read what your full amount is from your buyer agency agreement on the HUD, and then whatever difference needs to be made up from the buyer will be in a buyer expense.
And that would be like something where when they tell you cash to close, they just add in that amount for them to wire, and then that's cut out to you. But it is via just like straight from the buyer, not at
Yep,
this
it's
time.
additional closing costs. Yep.
And
It's
so
just
that-
You have to
it's one of
send
the
your
closing
buyer
costs.
agency agreement to the attorney.
The attorney will probably start asking for them. I think the next wave of confusion, and will be interesting to see. This might be a little conspiracy theorist. I think the closing attorneys right now are kind of in for a little bit of an awakening. Not their fault at all. There's a lot of extra work that's now going to be going into transactions to cover some of these.
So
Yep.
just to be clear, the only time you'd need the second compensation agreement is if you were then not getting it from the listing brokerage, or you were getting a certain amount, but there was still a remaining amount. And then in the unlikely event, the seller's like, sure, I'll pay you that amount directly. That's the only time we'd have the second compensation agreement.
Correct.
Okay. And then
Yep.
one last question. When it comes to the overages, so for example, your
Mhm.
buyer brokerage agreement says a certain amount, either a listing brokerage or a seller or a builder are offering a higher amount. If your buyers then want that amount to go to them, the difference in those two, we would then have an addendum that would say,
So if they're getting more than what's in the buyer agency agreement, you can either have an addendum or you can just strike the amount that's in there and change it.
so obviously we could strike them out and change it to, because it would be more, but it would be coming to the buying brokerage. So if the actual buyer wants that difference that's higher to go to them.
Got it. So if it's then at that point it would become so for new construction, then that would be written in new construction contract. Sorry, misunderstood that. And if it were a situation,
Oh, you go ahead.
Anytime that it's being offered more than the buyer has agreed to pay, and the buyer doesn't want that to go to you, then that would just become a buyer concession at that point.
And it would be written
into the purchase agreement.
You
It
mean
would
a
be
seller
separate from the
concession?
buyer agency agreement.
So
Yeah, a concession. Yeah, a concession is always from the seller to the buyer. So it would be a concession in the purchase and sale agreement. And it would be written in the purchase and sale agreement. It would not be written in any of the agency agreements, because that's a concession. That is not money going to a broker.
Okay, so if it were something where, say, you had agreed with your buyers for something, I mean, just like a resale contract, and you agreed on a certain percentage, and then it turns out the listing brokerage is offering more. Obviously, you could change that on your buyer agency agreement to the more amount, but if the buyer wants that difference to come to them, where would that be?
It would be in the concession. They would just not agree to you getting more, and then you would ask for it in seller concessions in the purchase.
But it'd be in the offer. It's in the offer. In the offer, you have an option.
Be in the
concession. Yes.
It would be in the purchase and sale agreement. So the offer, an offer is not a document. So it would be in the actual purchase and sale agreement.
That's what I meant, but yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And you would put it in the section where it would be like the closing cost section?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
It'd be in the closing cost section.
Okay.
All right, let me run through a couple of the chat questions, and then I know we have a couple hands raised. So Waverly asked if you could put a sign, is this offer contingent on a signed comp agreement? It's going to be, that's a gray area. You're towing on, honestly, I think it's not even towing on an ethical violation because you're making a contract contingent on the you getting paid. Here's where your leverage is. If the buyer doesn't know what they're covering in the difference, the buyer's not going to ratify the contract. So if you've got a situation where you've sent a comp agreement to a listing agent and they're going to say, and then you get in this, well, seller's not sure what they're going to pay until they know this and that sort of thing. The buyer at the end of the day, until they know specifically what their exposure is going to be on covering any difference in compensation, they're not going to sign off on it. So if you haven't heard back, then that's your leverage.
So
Let's
my
see.
my question is more like if you submit an offer, let's say, $10,000 over ask, but you want that $10,000 to be covered in comp and you have a separate addendum for that. What if the seller agrees to that offer, but then doesn't sign the comp agreement? So I'm saying, like, how can you protect yourself in that offer? Can you say, like, this offer goes in hand with this comp agreement?
Well, I mean, no, because at that point, the buyer would say, until I know that this is what I'm covering, I'm not going to sign that, because your buyer agency agreement's already established what they're going to owe you, what the total is. So in
Right.
that case scenario, if they don't, go ahead.
Same, but if you're trying to get it covered by the seller for your buyer, in the scenario of, yes, you've agreed to pay me this, but I'm going to try to get it covered, and we're strategizing on an offer contingent on that, because if the seller doesn't agree to cover it, maybe we change our terms.
Correct. And that's what would be then relayed back to the seller to say, until we know what the compensation is, the buyer is not able to sign off on this contract. So at that point, it would be a standstill.
Okay.
That would be the leverage on that. Yeah. All right. AJ would like to have share agency agreement. You're going to have to, closing agreements are going to, or excuse me, closing attorneys are going to be asking for agency agreements. Going to zero offer would yeah, I mean, Bill's point is, honestly, more and more listing brokers offering zero one could argue would simplify things. Well, one of two things would happen: either offer a set amount or offer zero. I think where this is going to get hairy is the ability for listing brokers to negotiate their commission. Julie said compensation agreements will be attached to the contract. No, it's separate. A compensation agreement is not between the parties of a contract, so they would be separate from that. Other forms section. Not sure if that is clear. Do we need to add the comp agreement into the contract? No. So comp agreement and the contract are completely separate. Again, this goes back to the compensation versus concession. Compensation is between a party and a broker. Concession is between the two parties of the contract, the buyer and the seller. So any concessions would be handled in the purchase and sale agreement. Any compensation would be handled on separate agreement, which would either be the listing agreement, the buyer agency agreement, or a compensation agreement. All right, Latricia.
So what I'm trying to figure out, okay, the brokerage is always going to get paid, right? No matter what. The broker.
That's not correct. No,
it
would have to be.
Yeah. Because what I'm thinking is, I'm like, okay, so if we're doing all this and we're the buyer's agent, and they're saying that they're not going to pay us, that means our broker does not get paid either. And how are they going to fit with that when? I mean, there's got to be some. I don't know. I guess I don't know how to word what I really trying to say. How I'm seeing this, but it just seems like it's just like are they trying to just get rid of buyer's agent altogether?
No, they're not. So just to clarify on that, this is not, nowhere in this is saying they're not getting paid. We're just saying we have to have a conversation on more of how they're getting paid. And again, if we operate under the belief, I'm not saying this is what Latricia's doing, but this has happened a lot. If we operate under the belief that simply not having this in the MLS means we're not going to get paid anymore, unfortunately, that is in full support of why the lawsuit happened. Right. But that's not what's happening. I'm not trying to blanket statement that's what people are thinking. But at the end of the day, like all this has done is remove the agreement made between everyone via the MLS. All of these agreements can still be made. It's just not using MLS as the default tool. All right. Jay and then Evan.
Earlier, Cynthia mentioned something that caught my attention a little bit. And so I was just going to ask for a little bit of clarity. You know, you mentioned that it's going to obviously come down to the settlement statement, and that's where it's all going to be itemized. You know, but what if you're in a situation where, you know, the buyer, particularly if you're on the buyer side of things, they do want to pay you separately? Can that be something that they do write a check for, pay you, and even though it's still included in the settlement agreement, much like how they pay for their appraisal ahead of time, but it also is included on the settlement statement?
I mean, I guess that would be, I don't see why not. I mean, you just have to make sure you have the paper trail with the attorney.
Right.
You know, at closing, they sign documents saying that there are no outside agreements between any of the parties of the contract. But in that situation, from a technicality standpoint, you're not a party to the contract as an agent. So I don't know why they would want to do that, because they don't pay until closing anyway. I think the concern would also be is not that people would do this, but you lose leverage at that point. Like, let's say, sure, I'm going to send you the check after closing, and they don't.
Right. Well, I agree. I don't necessarily think there's any situation where this would come up, but sometimes there's issues where they don't, the lender doesn't want it there, or, whatever the case may be. So just trying to think ahead.
Yep. Yeah. That'll be interesting to see that one. I'm not sure on that one, to be honest with you. All right, Evan.
Is there any reason, I'm just trying to think of this from like a pure simplicity standpoint, because obviously this is all confusing and convoluted.
None of that pure simplicity stuff.
Well, you're talking to the wrong guy for that, because everybody here knows that I'm a simple guy. So why can't we just, as a buyer's agent, why can't we just put everything in concessions and nix the entire compensation piece? Like, what's preventing us from doing that to keep it simple for the buyer and just move everything forward quickly?
Conceptually, nothing. That would be the absolute simplest way to do it. The challenge you have on that in the immediate is if you submit an offer to that right now and you just ask for it, and the seller's already got a listing agreement signed with the listing agent stating that their part of that compensation is going to the buyer, they then are running, or excuse me, buyer's agent, they then have to amend their contract to adjust accordingly. Because if they then go and sign the offer where you're offering, where you're asking for enough concessions, Bill, I've got your hand raised, don't worry, where you're offering enough concessions to cover the commission, but then they're also covering on the listing side, then they could be doubling down. So conceptually you could do it. Correct. The listing agent could end up collecting. The chances of that happening are nil, right? I mean, that's not going to happen yet. It just could. To answer your question simply, you're welcome to submit an offer that way and just simply say, hey, I'm not sure what you're offering, if you're offering, or what it is, but we're going to just have it all in here. Buyer's going to pay me. So if they're going to pay me, they're asking for this in concessions.
That's kind of exactly what I was thinking. Like, when you write an offer, you usually have somewhat of a summary, the highlights of the offer from a buyer's agent standpoint. So what if there's just an offer, the purchase and sale agreement, and in that you say, compensation is included in concessions. If you have an agreement between you and your seller, please counter with that offer. Yeah,
you absolutely can do that. That is a technique way to do it. And honestly, if that would be probably the best way to do it, should you not be getting a lot of communication from the listing agent.
Okay, cool.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right. Yep. I'm going to just keep going down the line. Cynthia, and I've seen questions in the chat. I'll jump to that in a second. Cynthia. You're muted. Cynthia, you're muted.
Woo, thank you, everyone. Okay. In regards to what Evan said, if we were to do those concessions, would that be in the, I mean, there's typically an amount that buyers can ask for in concessions depending on their loan type. So wouldn't that come up as an issue if we went that route?
It could. And so that would be, you would have, before you would do that, you would have to go to your buyer, basically your buyer cost sheet and say, here's what all is going to cost, make sure the lender's okay with it. And then you just go in saying, here's what it looks like.
Okay.
So it's a
And
good
then-
segue to the question that, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I say Rebecca's question is, when you pick up the closing check, the money's come from is it a concession, or are we still calling it compensation? It is still compensation. Compensation from a buyer, look at it this way, compensation from a buyer is now a closing cost to the buyer, right? That's just what it is, right? So when, just like one of their closing costs is the attorney's fee, we call that an attorney's fee. We don't call that a concession. Their appraisal fee is an appraisal fee. Their commission to their buyer's agent is their commission to their buyer's agent. A concession is simply the amount of money that is being given to the buyer to do with what they please. Now understand, the buyer still could pay said compensation without concession, right? The buyer doesn't have to have concession, and oftentimes won't, to pay compensation.
So, and if this is off topic, please let me know, but the listing agreement, there's that section that talks about whether or not you can say that you're offering concessions below the compensation area. And when I was listening to one of the, NAR updates, Austin Smallwood had said, I would mark no there because everything is negotiable. And this concession is talking more so about like, flooring examples, not so much like giving permission to explain compensation.
Yeah, so this would be an area, and let me pull that up. This is a relevant question. I don't. Let me make sure I'm going to say this correctly. Owner does not authorize listing broker to offer compensation to other broker. Nope. Owner does or does not allow broker to advertise the owner's willingness to negotiate seller concessions. I disagree on that. I think you should encourage your owner to allow you to say they would entertain concessions. I don't think it's necessary that you put it in the MLS. The challenge with putting no on there is the moment I call you and say, Cynthia, I'm going to make an offer, but they need some concessions. And you're like, yeah, he'll consider it. By definition, you've just advertised that he would consider concessions, which is against what he told you to do in the listing agreement.
Okay.
So this is an example. And again, my last 3 phone calls were to Austin. I have a lot of respect for them, and I do believe they're learning in this as well. I don't think that would be a good idea.
Okay. I just thought I was confused at that point if that was like, obviously if somebody asked, okay, yeah, that's enough. Thank you.
Yep. All right, Bill. You're muted.
Back to Waverly's question, I think you kind of left the answer hanging there, at least for me.
Okay.
Where she got her contract in a stalemate there because she made the offer with the extra money thrown in to cover the compensation, but they didn't know whether it was going to be accepted or not. So how do you move forward with that?
It's all going to be part of negotiation. There's not going to be set ways in these anymore. And that's the purpose. Like, that's the purpose of this. So in that case, I don't think it's going to happen as often as some do. But in that case, you're just have to have a conversation with the listing agent to say, listen, the buyer cannot commit to this because you're asking them to sign a document that is not and not knowing what their total closing costs are going to be. Because if we don't have an agreement on what compensation is, we cannot do a buyer net sheet for them to figure out what this cost is. And I mean, there's a possibility that you would come to a standstill at that point, but there's no way that you're going to guarantee that they're going to sign that before the buyer signing it. I mean, that's going to be your leverage. It really would be no different. Yeah.
So you're basically negotiating that commission ahead of the ratified agreement.
Yes, would be best case scenario.
confused on this because the buyer signs it first when submitting the offer. So what are you waiting to sign when the
Well, you
seller-
would want in that case to have sent the compensation agreement. So you know what the compensation is at that point. That would be the communication with the listing agent up front. So you would want the compensation agreement sent ahead of time to say, listen, want to make sure we're on the same page as this because the buyer's submitting an offer and they want to make sure they understand what costs that they may have.
Okay, so you do a comp without any offer, but then if the listing agent doesn't respond to you and you're worried about timeline, I mean, what do you do in that scenario?
At that point, I would ask for enough concessions to cover all of the commission.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
And then I guess the question originally was, if they don't agree to that, then you go back to your client and tell your client they're not agreeing to this, so you have to pony up for that.
Correct. That discussion already happened with the buyer agency agreement because that specifically states that could be a possibility.
Right.
Yeah. All right. All right, to the chat, and then I'll come to you, Al. Oh, wait, sorry, Bill, were you done?
Yeah, no, I'm done. Thanks for letting me raise my hand or figure it out.
Yeah, good job. We were all here for you. It was fun.
I didn't want to be
quickly in the
rude.
chat. Abasi, yes, this applies to realtors and then the association owned MLSs. Alan.
All right, so I just want to give you a big picture scenario because we're figuring out the mechanics, but we're forgetting something very important. The prices of homes include already whatever commissions are offered, and they're dictated by the market, by demand and supply. So while we're discussing the mechanics, the reality is that the market price is like a big pie chart. It had two slices, a commission for the listing agent, a commission for the buyer's agent. Now we're taking that slice to the buyer's agent and putting it in limbo so that it's either paid directly by the buyer or still paid by the buyer. The buyer is the only person who brings money to the table anyway. So if the seller is not willing to give that piece of the pie from their proportion, the price that the buyer pays needs to come down so that they can put the slice back in and build the market price. That's what I'm saying. I think that we'll figure out the mechanics, but I don't think this is going to affect market prices or whatever. It's just demand and supply.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there's a lot of this. I think I love how you wrapped that up because I think if we do get into the discussion that it was baked into the cake, therein lies again the need for the lawsuit because it just became an assumed cost for everyone. I do believe that there are going to be a couple of early on possible pops in value because people aren't understanding this and sellers aren't going to be like, no, I'm not negotiating at all. But I do believe that part of our job as buyers agents is to understand at the end of the day, this is what's being netted, right? And typically before, if they had paid more in closing costs because if they were paying the commission, they being the seller, then Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, I would recommend that this is still what you offer based on what the last comp sold for, right? I mean, you're right. At the end of the day, again, the consumer is smart, right? The consumer understands this and they are not going to just allow this to just be like, oh, fine. I mean, it'll get awkward if that happens. So
are we going to now continue to use the concessions offered in our comps as and the amount to reduce the comps sell price, if that makes any sense when doing CMAs? Because I've always been taught to, if there was concessions, you'll see that and you reduce that amount from the actual true sell price of the home. But if we're
I think you'll treat the concessions. Yeah, I don't know of a lot of people that would do it that way per se. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I think that will be something that the market plays out. I think we will look at it. We'll take into consideration what that looks like. I'm also going to be interested on what, that concession field is going to be pretty tight. It's going to be an amount. They're not going to allow for much of a description of what it is because they don't want to then start talking about commissions again.
Right.
Yeah. All right, when we do comps, will the seller concessions have commission? I doubt it. That was Compton's question was, will they have concessions or whether or not it includes commissions. I'll double check. Based on everything else they're doing right now, I highly doubt you're going to ever see the word commission mentioned in MLS again, at least for the near future. I think that would also be in concessions. That being said, I don't know. I mean, it'd be interesting to find out so people can understand what that looks like.
In a house that was sold and there was $36,000 in concessions, I'm like, was it because that's how much the seller paid because of commission, or because the value wasn't truly there and there was work needing to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think like that point, what Crompton said, I think at some point we'll start to learn what this looks like, and we'll start to learn the nuances. You know, the same way when we go to price a house and their neighbor went on the market and sold in 2 hours, you could pretty safely say they probably got pretty close to, if not above list price, right? I mean, you'll start to learn some of the things of what these indicators are.
I'm just feeling like it's going to devalue the market if that's the way it's done, and it's including the concessions as the commissions, included in the concessions as the commissions. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, they've always been a closing cost. They're just shifting over now in some situations.
Mm-hmm.
So, yep. All right. What other questions? Okay, Wednesdays at 10, except for next week because of mega camp, but we will have next Wednesday's 1 o'clock session, the conversations. That conversation, we'll do that. Bill's got his hand back up. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I made an assumption that you had left it up. That's my bad. I'm sorry.
But no, I did leave it up. Sorry.
Because I would have.
Yeah, I didn't know what to do there. I'm sorry. So back to the EXP decision of 0. What is the known logic behind that move? Is that purely to simplify this?
All right. So if you guys have any more questions about compensation and concession, let me know. Happy to answer those. And hold, please.